know him. He's part of the Raqs Media Collective, and I need to get the, I got the text on you so that it's easier for me to, since you're not a Bombay Wala. If you were a Bombay Wala, I would have known everything about you. So I'm sorry, but since you're not a Bombay Wala, I have to refer to the text. So Shuddha is an Shuddhabrata Sengupta is an artist and writer and a member of the Raqs Media Collective, a group that combines research, historical and philosophical inquiry, and contemporary art. In 2002, Sengupta co-initiated Sarai, a platform for discussing partnerships between theorists, researchers, practitioners, and artists, engaged in reflecting on contemporary urban spaces and culture inside Asia, at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in India. Sengupta also co-edits the Sarai Media series. Raqs Media Collective's work has been shown internationally at exhibitions such as Documenta in Kassel in 2009, the Istanbul Biennale, the Venice Biennale in 2005, the Guangzhou Biennale in 2005 again, and in Mehta in 2008. I'm sure there are many more which are not included here. But just for those of you who don't know the full spectrum of work that Shuddha's involved with, we're very pleased to have you, Shuddha. I think it's the first time you're coming to participate in the program.
That's right. I've been here as a visitor.
Yes, as a visitor. We're delighted to have you as a participant. And of course, Rohini, who is the star of the evening. And Rohini's wonderful show, which I know all of you have seen. I heard from Sri that some of you have not seen the show. And I strongly advise that we will keep the museum open, that you do go and visit after the talk and see the exhibition, because it's very important to be able to, in fact, be able to get dive into the discussion. You really do, I think it's good for you to have seen it, if you haven't. And so I think Rohini doesn't need much of an introduction, but I have one for Rohini as well. So let's see what. So Rohini is a painter, a printmaker, works in a variety of media, including sound, video, prints, large site-specific drawings. Her current body of work is a collection of strange terrains constructed by observing, recording, fictionalizing, and reimagining objects and spaces that exist at the interface between science, nature, culture, perception, and production. Now, she has shown at the Museum of Art and Technology in Lisbon, the Singapore Science and Art Museum, at the Dhaka Art Summit, at the Whitechapel Gallery in London, at the Fukuoka Asian Art Triennale, at the Kochi Museum Biennale, and there is a whole long list. I'm not going to go through all of it. But more than anything else, it's the work itself which speaks. And so, yeah, let's start. And I think all of you know me, so I don't need to introduce myself. Okay. Let's see if these are working. Hello? One. Hello? Hello? So I just wanted to start by, भैया एक और टेबल यहाँ पे दे देंगे या तो एक कुर्सी कुछ ले आना, ये सामान सब रख लें, यहाँ पे ये सारा सामान रख लें, कोई कुर्सी दे दीजिए. So I just wanted to start with why we in the museum. So a lot of people ask me, how do you decide which artist and who to invite? And you know, historically it's been a program that we have engaged with
artists from the JJ School of Art because, as you all know, I think, the School of Art and the museum had a historic relationship, a symbiotic relationship, really. The curator of the, sorry, I'll just put this off, sorry. Too many things. So historically, the museum and the School of Art had this relationship, and the museum was really very much initially planned as a showcase for the works of the School of Art. The School of Art was, at that time, as for those of you who are not familiar, was a place not just in the early years not devoted really to painting, but very much to design and to craft in a sense. You know, the decorative arts, because it was again oriented towards trade. And so, so many of the objects that you see in the museum were actually produced by students of this JJ School of Art. The models that you see upstairs, there was a master modeler, and he was assisted by students of the School of Art. So there was this symbiotic relationship. In fact, the museum was originally supposed to be located right next to the JJ School of Art. But because at that time there was a malaria epidemic, and they felt that, you know, that wood was not the most conducive place to put up this institution that was going to be dedicated to the Queen, it was then shifted to Baikala, which then at that time was considered to have a very salubrious environment. Anyway, that's for the history. So this symbiotic relationship, and so the premise on which we look at artists is that, one, coming out of the JJ School of Art, what is their practice? Does it engage with ideas that on which the museum's foundations are premised? So natural history is one of them. In fact, it was an encyclopedic museum in the early stages. For 75 years, there was no museum. If you in the city, and the Prince of Wales came up much later, and then unfortunately we got a little bit of stepmotherly treatment or stepfatherly treatment, whatever you want to call it, and we were a bit neglected after that, and that became the Grand City Museum, and many of our objects and artifacts, in fact, went to the Prince of Wales Museum. So looking at that history, and of course also looking at you know, many issues, the issues of identity, how do you read the interpretation of culture that the colonials had. So it's a very layered sort of subject. And so one looked at the practice of the different artists, and based on the kind of work that they were doing, we invite them to show in the museum. And so there have been artists like Kalur, for example, whose practice is very different. He's not a JJ School of Art student, he's from Baroda. But he has, of course, had a wonderful exhibition at the museum. Then we have people like Jitesh and Sudarshan, etc., who are JJ artists. And in fact, we've been trying to do mostly JJ, you know, give the JJ artists the platform first, and bring them in to engage with this, what we call a conversation with the museum, a conversation with its collection, its history, and because it represents the city, even the city. And so the larger frame has been the JJ School artists, but we haven't strictly stuck to that. So when I met Rohini in Delhi, and I said, Rohini, I'm very intrigued with your work, and I really would like you to tell me a little bit more about it. As she was speaking, and she's one, I mean, the work speaks for itself, but as we were going through the work, I was thinking to myself, this is so much about where the museum, what the museum is about. It's about deep time. It's about looking at the future. It's like a practice of archaeology of a kind. And there are so many resonances. And then, her interest in science, because it was very much the 19th century and the thinking, the foundation for museums across the world was very much, one stream was the British Museum stream, but the other stream was science, was the practice of recording, of documenting, and doing it in a very scientific way. So there were many of these interfaces. So then we said, Rohini, I said to her, I think it would be wonderful if you come into the museum, and I think it turned out to be a wonderful show. Then Himanshu is here. Himanshu was helping me with developing some of the ideas and the curation, and Himanshu manages the collection at the museum. And I said to Himanshu, now we have to find we'll go through the collections and find something that Rohini would speak to her practice and which she could respond to. And he found this planisphere, which was just sitting somewhere lost in the library, and it wasn't even recorded. So when we get accused of not having recorded documents, actually this was one of the objects, which is such a wonderful object, which has not been recorded. And then we restored it, we conserved it, and of course that is one of the important works that she did. But also, we took out these amazing fossils, which I hadn't seen for ages because we put them away. We don't have the space to showcase our natural history collection. So we put them away, and when Himanshu brought them out, I thought, oh my God, they were just so beautiful. And I had to push Rohini a little bit. She was like, I'm not sure I can do this. I don't think we have the time. And I said, well, you can. Just think about it. I said, we won't do this show again for some years. Think about it. And she stepped up to the plate, and I think she did an absolutely magnificent work, which you've all seen. And so, yes, so I'd like to sort of ask you, Rohini, do you want to, there are many sort of things that you've talked about or that you discussed. But one of the other areas which was very interesting is the area of practice, of process and practice. And I actually copied down what you wrote. This is not anybody else who wrote. And I was very intrigued by what you said. And it's very much about, this museum as well. The artifact as a generative thing, which cuts across interfaces not only of making and material, but also practice and process. This ecological approach to the study of skill liberates us from the severely reductive belief that the technical must be mechanical and therefore isolated from the body and the environment. So you want to talk about whatever you'd like to share with the audience.
No, we can start there. That was actually with reference to a text by Tim Ingold, and the chapter is called Weaving a Basket, and he basically talks about the idea that there are some processes where you actually can't make a distinction between making and technique. That some things like the basket, in this sense he's talking about the reed basket, so he's talking about material actually being living in a sense, that the basket is suggesting the way forward as well. So I was interested in this particular text because it speaks to another body of my work, which is video feedback, which I feel is one of these very embodied processes. But it does also speak to this show. So coming back to our conversation about how it all began, the idea actually that links the whole show together is the idea of the field, which is something that I'm really interested in. And one of the reasons it's so important that Shuddha is here is that because it actually began in 2010 on a grant that I got at a Sarai City as a Studio Fellowship. So just to backtrack a bit, I've been an amateur astronomer for as long as I've been an artist. So I would be traveling with a lot of amateur astronomers, I would go to sites and we would do observations and we would see things, but it was never something I thought that would be part of practice. And then what happened is I saw a total solar eclipse, the longest of the millennium in Patna in 2009. And I was standing on the rooftop and it was an occluded eclipse. So there were clouds, early morning, couldn't see anything. But there was such euphoria on that rooftop. And I just felt like there's something here that can be channeled potentially. So Sarai put a call out for a city as a studio. And I just said, okay, this is a test. Can I write a one-page proposal and make sense of it? So I just said I want to document their lives. I want to chronicle what they do and why they do it. So long story short, basically over the past 5 years I've become interested in the idea of the field. The field as a series of physical sites, as in the case of a lot of the work that you see, the sea forts, the observatories, the telescopes. But then when we began talking about the Bharat Jilal being a natural history museum, also the idea of the museum as a field
of investigation.
And also the idea of the field, then the fact that natural history museums, Wunderkammer, cabinets of curiosity, botanical gardens, all of these are sites of wonder, which is something I'm very interested in, the idea of wonder. And also what populates these spaces, curiosity, those kinds of things. And the practices that then go hand in hand with that, which is observation, as you said, recording, which are all things that I also find myself falling into when I go to a site. So you have the field, the second level of that engagement is observation, then collecting material, and then finally speculation, into fiction, which is that's how we come to speculations from the field. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Shuddha, one of the things you said to me when we met recently was that the reason that contemporary art is able to communicate itself here in this space is because it's a site of wonder. And would you like to elaborate a little bit, talk about it in reference to the
Perhaps we can come back to the question of the field.
Yes.
Because it's the field of the question that I think is the really important one here. The title that you've given the show in Marathi is actually fascinating because it's Tarka Kshetratil Anveshan. Right? Now, it could have been Kshetratil Anveshan, which is what would be the direct translation of investigations in the field, speculations in the field. But when you say it's a Tarka Kshetra, it means it's a field of arguments, it's a field under discussion, it's a field that's emerging through a conversation. Now, when I look at Rohini's work, especially cited as it is over here, where it makes profound sense because it's this museum, as you rightly said, was a space of wonder, of curiosity, of doubt, and of the dispersal as well as the uniting of different kinds of curiosity. And I want to spend a little time thinking about that. Particularly, for instance, in this room where the fossils, the reserve collections, the natural history sections of the museum are displayed in these beautiful vitrines, and we have this beautiful wall drawing, which is very intriguing for me. And I told Rohini, do you realize that your wall drawing is also a fossil? She said, what do you mean? I said, because it's made out of charcoal. And charcoal is a fossil. Charcoal is the remains of forests of millions of years ago. And if you think about what that room is, it's redolent of so many ways of thinking about what is the field. In her case, the field is the open sky. The field is also what's under the earth. And an axis that unites the core of the earth with the deepest reaches, the farthest reaches of the sky, is really generous in the way it makes us think about the question of what is the field. In other words, here with this work, we begin entering a space where she gives us the possibility of thinking that the field ends wherever we want it to be. That the horizon line depends on our ability to locate a boundary between ourselves and the universe. And that can change. In the room where there's an open camera looking out at the sky, we're looking out at a deep time. Because whenever you're looking at the sky, you're looking at stars that don't really exist anymore. We're often illuminated by starlight from entities that have no existence anymore. So we are doing time travel. I remember we talked about this in Delhi, in your show, when we looked at the moon. And I said that whenever you look at the moon, you're actually looking at something that existed 27 seconds before it is now, because that's the time that it takes for the light to come to the moon. Similarly, when we look at the earth and we look at the fossil, we're looking at deep time because, for instance, the fossils that are present in that room, many of them are of marine creatures. Now you might wonder, what is a shark tooth doing in the middle of the Deccan Plateau? It's doing something in the middle of the Deccan Plateau or in the foothills of the Himalayas because once upon a time the foothills of the Himalayas was under the sea. So this upheaval of the earth, where the sea becomes land and the land becomes sea, is the fundamental contribution of geology, making us think about Earth, about deep time in a different sense. And a fossil has a very strange, ambiguous status as an object. Before, and we must remember that fossils were discovered before Darwin, did his Origin of Species, before we knew evolution. And it was very evident to people that a fossil was a very old thing. Now, given that people thought, even up to the 19th century, that the Earth was created on the 2nd of October in 4044 BC, which is the date, it was very difficult for people to understand what these things that seemed much older were. And so there were various disputations in the field about what is a fossil. So some people said these are remnants of animals that don't exist anymore. Some people said that they're actually artworks. They're secret artworks planted into the earth, either by cultures much developed than ours, or by God himself. That these are instances in which God, for instance, was trying out life forms before he actually made them. So it's very interesting to think about the fossil then. Is a fossil a work of nature or a work of art? Right? And what your work does in this museum is to turn that question again to us. Are we looking at nature? But is the artist looking at nature and making us think about something else, making us think about meaning itself, the meaning of an object? So whether it's, is this the bed of a river seen from outer space? Is this a vein in the body? Is this a fissure on the earth? Is this a fault line? Is this a living being? Is this something dead, or is it something that never was alive? I think your work makes it possible for you to ask these set of questions as a set of shifting boundaries, which is why it's very appropriate that it is in this museum. Because this museum is a museum about shifting boundaries. Where does art end and craft begin, or industry begin? What is the relationship between the human and the natural sciences? What is the relationship between thinking about human beings themselves as classifiable forms of life and the unity of being? So the museum asks us to ask all these questions. And that's why I think that an exhibition like this, which more appropriately named Tarka Kshetratil Anveshan, allows us to ask and argue and tell stories about questions themselves.
Would you like to respond to that, really?
No, I think that's, I love that reading of this room as well, because actually, it's true. I was thinking actually along the lines of the idea of a vertical time, so looking at the idea of superimposition, which is the basis of geology, which suggests that what is lower down will be older.
Superposition, horizontality,
yes, and verticality.
Lateral continuity.
Yeah, exactly. But then the thing is, you're right, because actually part of this is taken a satellite image of a river, which is I've then played around with a lot. But equally, what is interesting is that there's something interesting that happens when it could be any of these three things. Which it could be a crack in the wall. It could be, as you said, a riverbed from an aerial perspective. It could be, a vein. But the interesting thing is, all these three perspectives are not possible simultaneously. One of them you have to pick. So that creates also a sense of vertigo, which is always interesting, I think. So that's interesting. But I like the idea of, deep time was also just because when I looked at these amazing objects which are in the collection, it's been like one thing I can scratch off my bucket list, work with fossils, that kind of thing. Because it's been something I'm really, really interested in. And to be able to show them, this was also the only time I have worked where the wall drawings, because I've done a series of them. This is not the first wall drawing, but this is the first wall drawing which is engaged with other objects. Otherwise, they're always standalone drawings. But when they're engaging with other objects in the same space, something very different happens. So I think this is one of the drawing that I've exercised the most restraint also, because I felt like it needed to be a conversation with, the room is the work, the drawing is not the work. The vitrines and the fossils and the drawing is the work, not, that was very, very important to me.
So there's also the idea of decay that comes through very strongly, especially in the Shivering Sands work. You know, it's a very interesting juxtaposition, because in terrestrial, I'm sorry, the idea of preservation, and then, you know, so those juxtapositions also which happen in this exhibition, which is again very much some of the ideas that are what the museum is about, both about preservation and about decay, and this constant need to preserve what you have, and the idea. So, was that at any point something that you have been engaged with, or have looked at, or has that in any way informed your work? I mean, I see that as something which is there. Maybe should I want to? Yeah.
Actually, I don't, not consciously, I don't think,
Not
but I'm really interested that would, you know. Also, I think it's interesting in the way that it, when you navigate the show here, you know, I think those oppositions and those conversations and interfaces come across more. But I don't know if it's a conscious.
It's not something that you.
No, I don't think so. I think with Shivering Sands, it was, as we said again, it was the field, it was the site, it was my engagement with it, and then actually the footage was shot in 2012. The film was finished in April this year. So there's usually always a long chunk when I sit on the stuff and try and figure out what it needs to be. You know, it sort of has a very interesting, well, you know, you have to figure out what it needs to be. And when I found the text that this curator had very kindly let me just, her PhD thesis. So what happened is that...
So you should tell them a little bit about
that. So the site that we're talking about are these sea forts, Second World War anti-aircraft sea forts that dot the Thames estuary. And I had shot the footage and I had come back, and then I was doing a studio visit with this curator from the States. Her name is Laura Rakovich, and we were just sharing work, and I was showing her the raw footage because we had a really good chat. And then she said, you know, you must read my PhD thesis, and that was where we left it. So she went back, she sent it to me. So the title is called At the Lightning Fields, and it's about a totally different site. It's about an installation in the New Mexico desert by the artist Walter de Maria, and it's basically 200 steel rods dug into the desert. So it was her experience of this site over a period of 10 years, going back several, like 20 times. So it's this lovely poetic, and when I read the text, you know, like you have that feeling where you suddenly like, oh my God, you know, like there's a real connection between my experience of this very different site and your experience of this site. So I said, she said, just, you know, do what you would like. So and again, in fact, I spoke with Shuddha again at that point, because it was a real struggle. Text is something I have not worked with before, and it has a whole other register. So it was a question of, okay, how do you deal with this? And in fact, Shuddha was the one who also said that, well, you know, how about treating it like a found text, like something that is erased? So again, she was perfectly happy for me to annotate, edit, so that's what happened there. And I felt like then there are bits where there are two separate registers, where they're contrapuntal, other points they come into this sort of strong, but that was sort of, yeah.
Do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, again, I want to come back to this museum and what the sighting of this work means here. In this room, there's also some mineral fragments. And there's a beautiful mineral called feldspar. Feldspar is the most common surface material of the earth. Feldspar means two things. It means trace of the field. So it's actually, that's what it is. But feldspar is basically a form of igneous, that is volcanic lava material under pressure that either extrudes or is under the surface. And it is usually something that never founds or creates ores. So you can't do very much with it, but it becomes the raw material for gypsum, for wall material, for all sorts of things, for paint, for instance, for talcum powder. So whenever next you're putting talcum powder in your body, you're actually looking at volcanic rock. Yeah. But that apart, what interests me is the question of how do we create and tell stories in a museum? Let's look at Shivering Sands. Shivering Sands is a work of extraordinary depth, I think, because it again allows us to think about the creation of an entire world. Like the Terrasphere, these are all world-making works, in the sense that you could think that, let's say, the Terrasphere is a planet on its own, a little one, you know, like the one in Little Prince, that little planet. So it's just a little planet on its own. Shivering Sands is a watery world in which there are these strange red relics that remain. And you could imagine that's all there is. That's all there is left of life. If you look a little bit at what those fortresses are, remember I told you, they were designed by a very crazy guy called Guy Moncel. He was a sort of Irish-British engineer, born incidentally in Srinagar, and perhaps lived a few years as a toddler in Bombay, right, before he was shipped off to school. So he's the guy who made those forts, who designed those forts. Now, you have to think about fortresses that were never actually used because they were never attacked. So those anti-aircraft guns on the Thames estuary were not even used at the Battle of Britain because the aircraft came from somewhere else. That had been waiting to enter a situation of war, but never did. You think of the birthplace of Guy Moncel, where there are ugly concrete, pre-stressed concrete bunkers all over the city of Srinagar right now, which are constantly in use against a population that is defenseless against them. Now, how does one begin to make these connections? So for me, coming to a work like this is an opportunity to make connections between things that are decaying, like the feldspar or the fossils, right? They are traces of life that used to be. But in the same way, I think you have this very nice quote by Lorraine Dunstan, the director of the Max Planck Institute where you did the residency, where she says that, geology and astronomy are disciplines that allow us to ask questions based on the materials of the deep past into the deep future, right? So, here we're looking at fossils in one room, we're looking at the sky in another room, we're looking at the making of worlds in another room, and while we're doing that, we're navigating this crazy museum with these wonderful objects. And you're trying to make sense of the fact that for all these hundreds of years, people have been trying to make meaning of whatever they find. All the materials in the museum, let's say there are ivory carvings, are actually elements of dealing with decay. What is ivory? Ivory is the broken tooth of a dead animal. And if with that you make an extremely beautiful carving, you're basically trying to defeat the logic of death itself. So decay, objects under distress, objects under scrutiny of some kind that turn them into lifeless beings, also then return in some peculiar way to ask us all these questions that allow us to make the connection between fortresses in the middle of the sea, the formation of a little world inside this thing. Even what's the work with where you look at the open sky?
Through the telescopes, atmospheres.
Atmospheres. Now, if any of you haven't seen the show, please go and see it. Because there's something quite remarkable that happens in atmospheres, which is these bugs, these insects that keep landing actually sometimes on the lens itself. Who are these beings? Because you could say that they are the absent shooting stars of day, right? In the absence of night, these bugs become emissaries of the universe. So, now, of course you can ask these questions in the abstract, but the questions occurred to me this afternoon again because of the way in which the museum itself lends itself to that experience of rethinking distress and decay as a form of life.
So, should we open it up to all of you and ask you? I think this has been quite very, especially with Shuddha, who knows so much about natural history. I had no idea that you had this sort of deep knowledge.
Why do you think we get along so well?
This kind of deep knowledge. It's not just deep time,
deep knowledge.
and the deep into the future, but deep knowledge. So, should we just? I mean, there are lots of people here who I'm sure have comments and go. You know, I think we'd love for you to visit the show after this conversation because you can go back to it with different eyes. Anybody? Would you like to comment or say something or ask a question? Come on.
I mean, whilst both what we were speaking about, in fact, titles, speculations, I mean, the idea of the spectacle, the eye, the ocular, which is right at the center of that word,
Yep, yep.
is also in some ways the center of the field. Because to recognize a field, you've got to locate yourself in it.
Absolutely.
And I was kind of interested in how do we look at fields, for instance. I mean, I'm absolutely convinced that Deepika is on my left and you are in front of me. And Deepika will be absolutely convinced that I'm on the right,
Yep.
and somebody else is behind her, because each of us center ourselves to locate things around us. So time, space, the depth of time, the depth of space are by our virtue of the ocular position that we take of ourselves at the center by default.
Yeah.
And I was kind of interested in this kind of default position through which we access the idea of the field.
Yeah.
And if there's any thoughts that you might have
No.
about this.
No, you can keep that in case someone else. I'm just going to I completely, I think that's absolutely true. Also, I was just thinking the word specular within speculative. I mean, specular also comes from the idea of the mirror, which I find really interesting because the mirror is always a reversed image. And so what I find very interesting with a lot of the work is that a reversal of a mirror or the reversal of an image sometimes creates this sort of unfamiliarity or the strangeness, which I'm really interested in, how the familiar becomes sort of really strange. So that's just, but I agree that, where you position yourself within the field is absolutely.
Jitish, the first thing about fields is that I think every field is a story that we're telling each other. Let's say time. We were in Sri's gallery in the morning, Project 88. They have a calendar, which is a beautiful calendar. It's the old-fashioned calendar, which is just the dates in black and red. Nobody makes those calendars. I yearn for those calendars. What is a calendar? A calendar is just a field of time, right? It says the month of September or October, whatever it is. How do we make these decisions about what is the month of September? We're basically looking at three objects. The Earth spinning, and one spin is a day. Moving around the sun, another object. One move is a year. And then there's the moon, which is also doing its thing. And every month is just our count. You have a beautiful work, no? The lunar. Yeah. I mean, I've always remembered that work. The month counted through these burnt chapatis. In Bangla, my mother tongue, there's a beautiful poem by Shuddhabrata Bhattacharya which says that Purnima Chand naki jhalshano ruti. Is it the full moon or is it burnt chapati? Right? So what's the field between the earth and moon? It's just a story we're telling each other. So that's, for me, the eye itself is reporting something. The eye is also, the brain tells a story about the eye. We're not actually seeing what the eye sees. If our eyes were video cameras, then our field of vision would be quite choppy, right? But we have this smooth experience of the visual field because the brain corrects the eye. Or the brain actually
Creates the vision.
tells us a story about what the eye is seeing.
I mean, just to extend from that, while you're speaking, this stream of consciousness, flow of imagery. I mean, you also think of then time as nothing but the ocean of gravity, which is the dance of gravity, which then becomes our sense of periodicity, not even time, because time is still the next level of, the incalculable or probably the inaccessible. Periodicity is something that we use to capture, domesticate the inaccessible and the incalculable.
I once asked an elderly lady who was an astronaut.
Because we're recording.
I once asked an elderly lady who was an early astronaut about what does it feel like to be up in the space station. And she said two things are quite strange. One is your periods just go forever. There's no gravity, right? Nothing flows. That's one. And the second thing she said is you get used to 16 sunrises every day. So, two accounts of time. In a sense, what does it mean to be at a time of the month? and what does it mean for day to turn into night became a completely different experience for her.
Since you mentioned about color, it's just an interesting article which I recently read.
Yeah.
That apparently scientists have proved that till a few hundred years back, people actually could not see the color blue.
Yeah.
It's a recent thing in the evolution of
Yeah, it's the same. Yeah, it's the same. Yeah.
The article suddenly came to mind when
Yeah.
we were discussing that. And I'm also interested in this, we're discussing about the role of the observer in art, and it kind of reminds me of this observer effect of quantum science, where everything exists in a realm or field of X number of possibilities. Still, the observer actually meets the observation and converts, a set of possibilities into a reality. So I just wanted to like your opinion or take on that.
How would we compute a month on Jupiter? It's got 9 moons. The observer on Jupiter would have a very different sense of moons from.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting. It's one of those paradoxes. When I'm looking at the idea of observation also, one is the observer effect, there's also the street light effect, which is that researchers will only look at places where you're going to get a positive outlook. So it's interesting. The idea of observation itself is, if you break it down in the many ways it could be read, it's fascinating. Yeah, absolutely.
Shuddha, this is especially for you because thanks for noticing that Shuddha in ambition, because my colleagues and I spent like days just thinking about what
Great time.
Yeah, you told.
Thanks for that. The second thing which I want to ask you is the idea of displacement, and especially in the film news which comes from Shivering Sands, and you have these.
I'm sorry?
Shivering Sands.
Shivering Sands. Yes. These poles, it's dislocated in this fictional landscape,
Yeah.
and which is absolutely, a different genre altogether.
Yeah.
So how do these, the idea of displacement plays an important role while you think of museum, because the sports are located somewhere in the Chalet, are now speaking like how does that and in Bombay. So how do that whole idea floats around?
Yeah, for me it was also, we'll come back to the work itself. So, Shivering Sands, as we said, we know what they are. So they're Second World War anti-aircraft sea forts. They were used as pirate radio stations briefly after that. Now they're just abandoned. So what I'm interested in is like what else we can imagine them to be, right? So if we did imagine them to be observatories, what would they observe? What if they were nomadic? What if they, got up and vanished for 1 century and then reappeared again? So which is why field notes, which is the photographs you're talking about, and then encounters of the remote kind, are them in these other sites, right? So they could be in Ladakh, in a riverbed or something like that. So the idea was just, as I said, just an exercise in, what, and also the idea that they might be then found by some strange, expedition explorer who happened to be able to document these sites. And I love that, for instance, here they are shown in the vitrine. And again, I love the idea that maybe they are real, So I love, for me, I think, it's really interesting that the work, it takes on an entirely different meaning within this, which is part subversive, but also part just,
We also have another very interesting collection of 12 works by John Forbes, who was in Tibet and documented the Himalayas. Beautiful. I haven't shown the works. I haven't shown those to you. We should show them to you. Yeah, I forgot about them. There's so much that we try to. But that idea of an expedition.
Yeah, it's very
going
interesting.
out there and
exactly. What are the forms in which you can explore exploration? How do you
examining the terrain and then documenting that and then isolating or focusing on those things which you think will have meaning. Not just, it's interesting because the idea of the observer, that issue comes in, because it's an interesting thing as an artist, because all art, the point is that you want to be able to reach out to the other person, to be able to communicate. Your work needs to speak. So how much of that consciousness is there in terms of, how will others read this? Or is it just, this is this is amazing and I want to document it. I mean, it's an interesting sort of tension with, in terms of whether, I mean, as the two artists, you know, it would be interesting for you to comment on that. The role of the observer, the other in a sense, who will also then participate in the work. And many, many others who will participate. Whether those are some, you know, those are things. I mean, I don't know.
So I think, I mean, like, I've always found, like, with every work that I finish, there's a piece of text that goes with it. And for me, it's important that it be in the space. I would like, so at least if you would like to know more about why I did what I did, then it's there. But I don't feel like I don't make it, you know, like, I think it's important because I would like people to know what I was thinking, at least, with reference to something, you know, because then I feel almost like it completes the work. I'm not, I have to finish that piece of text with every work I do. That's, yeah. But that's just...
You know, when Rohini and I were coming into Bombay today from the airport, we were having this conversation as people from Delhi always do when they come to Bombay. How lovely it is. We're more generous with you guys than you were with us. But one of the things I told Rohini was that, you know, what I miss in Delhi is we don't have a horizon.
Yeah.
You have so many horizons in Bombay. Why am I talking about horizons? Because I think a museum or a library actually offers people horizons, shifting frontiers. So that the closer you get to an object, in some senses, then it recedes again and it produces another sense of distance. And that leads you on, right? I remember talking to you earlier in the afternoon when you said that you used to come to this museum as a child. Whenever I came to Bombay as a child, I used to come to this museum because I was absolutely gobsmacked by what this museum had. And this was the time before you transformed, right? So, I mean, I think now of what happens to people, especially young people and children who come to the museum today in its transformed state, what it must be doing to their sense of horizons. That's what I think about when you ask me about displacement. It's the ability to be in any place on the earth and to reconstitute the world and the universe as a central experience for you. So it doesn't matter if you're growing up in Mira Road, you take the train to Churchgate, you come, or Baikala, wherever you are, I don't know.
Baikala.
You come here, and the world gets reconstituted for you in many ways. Whether it's through the walk in the garden, and you see what you have, baobab trees here. Baobab trees grow only in 3 places in India. This is one of them, right? So that reconstitutes the world for you. I always think that museums are time machines, but they're also ports. They're also ways of setting out the ships of your imagination and your reason. Because if we live in a world which was produced by tectonic plates shifting, which leads to these strange displacements such that we have in the Himalayas fossils of ammonites that once used to swim in the Antarctic Ocean, right? So if you have a fossil of an ammonite here, it's possible to tell a story about the Earth and its displacement and its conjunctions. That's the work of the imagination, and that's where science and art in an old-fashioned way meet. Or you have natural history, which is the history of the Earth. Or you have natural philosophy, which is what science used to be called in better times. So these possibilities of expanding horizons produce a way in which being in a city like Bombay allows you an experience not just of the world itself, but also of deep time and deep space. You have an artist like Rohini Devasher, then that gives you an added advantage, because then it forces the question. A couple of weeks ago, I was somewhere in the Arctic Circle, had a village, somewhere in the far northeastern corner of Sweden, waiting for somebody to come and think about time. Now, if you're a kid who goes past that museum every day on your way to school, you stop in that museum and somebody tells you, did you know that this little piece of rock, which is pure iron, and that we're now working on a work that thinks about iron, which is why I was there, comes from before the time the solar system was formed. And it is from that time that our blood has iron in it. aging is just, that's where you have antioxidants. It's because we rust. So that's what it is. That's what museums do. Museums can do. I mean, that's the scale and intensity of the wonder that museums and artworks and going to museums and produce.
Anybody else like?
You used the sketch of the manosphere with the different days of the stars. And you have made also other drawings that you've seen through the telescope.
No, that's not through a telescope.
No, I know that's through the telescope.
Yeah.
I'm asking if you have done things through the telescope as well, of different objects.
No. Actually, the reason being that it's interesting. I've asked that. So I've been on a couple of sites, and I realized this when I went to Hanle, which is this second highest observatory it's in Ladakh. And I went there with a group of amateur astronomers. So they were doing, they were doing the star trails at night, and they were. I mean, we can't. They're also. It's interesting that most of these are not optical telescopes. So most of them are radio telescopes, and the heart of it all is in Bangalore, So, but it was interesting that I realized at that moment that I was not interested in what they did and what they were looking at, coming back to the idea of the observer also, but I was interested in their lived experience of it. So I'm interested really in why they do what they do, what draws them to the night sky, and then as a way of understanding also myself as both participant, observer, why do I do what I do? But yeah, I mean, I would love to be able to look through maybe an optical telescope, and then, because I haven't done that yet, but it would be cool. Yeah.
Sorry, just one thing, to come back to your question. I don't know what camp showed when they did their show here, but I was just thinking about it today. There's a section in your museum where there are these amazing models of boats, and which include the dhows that ply the Arabian Sea. Right? Now, so this place, where do those models come from? Why were they being made? Were they being made just as objects, or were they being made to also teach people what are the parts of a boat? Right? And how, because this knowledge of boat building in this part of the world, we tend to think of Bombay as a city on the western coast of India, but Bombay is also a city in the eastern edge of the Arabian Sea. So in a sense, there is a world that unites Bombay, Yemen, East Africa, Egypt, right, which the boats plow, and this city is formed by that. So in a sense, thinking about an object like that allows us to create, I wouldn't say even a displacement, because actually this is a real placement of the city in its consciousness. This is how we can see the world, instead of this, what is it that you say here, Amchi Mumbai? Right? As if the city belonged only to some people, and it actually belonged, it has always belonged to the whole world. So this, coming to this museum, looking at those boat models, is a way of thinking about that consciousness.
So on that wonderful note, we shall, since there aren't any more questions, I'm looking, and I don't know that I can put in many more people on the spot. But thank you everyone.
And thank you so much for giving me this.
And Rohini. And thank you all of you. And if you have, I think we should all go back and see the show, because I think it would be a different experience after this conversation. I'm also going to go back after all the wonderful things that should have. Yours, of course, I know. But this is a whole new discovery, all these interesting details that you gave us. Maybe we should get you to do a walkthrough. That would be very nice. You bring you that particular perspective, which is, a kind of, because you've been looking and you've been interested in the subject and looking at it in a way, and it brings a whole different dimension to the work, which it opens up so many other possibilities that we may not be aware of. So,
thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.
Thank you for this opportunity. It's been amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.